A verdict of obedience of the Sharia court on a disobedient Muslim wife. This is a love story that was written in English and translated into Arabic by Dr. A. Ahmed. Copyright. All rights are reserved. All characters in this book are fictional, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. No part of this book may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means without the prior written permission of the author except by a reviewer who may quote brief paragraphs in a review to be printed in a newspaper, magazine, school journal, or university article. This story is about 3 Muslim girls who were subjected to gross injustice, severe violence, and abhorrent persecution by Muslim men, religious leaders, Sharia court judges, and police officers in the Islamic community and the religion of Islam and its misogynistic, hateful, and abusive teachings against women's rights, which are innumerable. For example, beating of women, polygamy, child marriage, circumcision of the private parts of small Muslim girls, which is known as female genital mutilation or FGM, slaying them in honor killings, inequality between males and females in inheritance, testimony in court, marriage, divorce, men's guardianship over women, controlling their lives and destinies as if they are minors, physically handicapped or mentally retarded, and forcing them to wear the hijab, niqab, or the humiliating burqa, which makes them appear as if they are scary ghosts. Muslim men are allowed by the Quran to have sex or rather rape without the need for marriage captive women of war such as wives, daughters, sisters, and even mothers of the defeated enemies who are called unclean infidels such as Jews, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, atheists, etc. Islam forbids a Muslim woman to become a president of a country or a boss at work or a judge in court, and she is strictly forbidden to lead men or women in prayer as an imama. Moreover, the Prophet Muhammad said the woman is an unclean creature just like a dog and a donkey, and therefore as a defiled being she annuls the man's prayer if she passes in front of him while he is praying. The Quran likens the woman to the human excrement which spoils the man's ablution or religious cleansing. Many Islamic countries prevent women from going to school and work, and they are not permitted to drive cars, bicycles, or motorbikes. And none of them is allowed to leave the house without her husband or with the muharram man the woman is forbidden to marry, such as her father or brother. They are forbidden to practice any kind of sports, such as soccer, basketball, volleyball, and tennis, and they are not allowed to go to gymnastics, beaches or swimming pools, cinemas, or theaters, or act as heroines in movies or actors in the stage in plays, or be female singers, or compete in beauty contests such Miss World or Miss Universe. They cannot compete in the FIFA Women's World Cup of soccer or football because Islam doesn't allow them to reveal their heads, hairs, faces, hands, shoulders, legs, thighs, and hips, or put short pants like men because each Muslim woman is a wara or naked creature. They are not permitted to be reciters of the verses of their holy Quran because the Prophet Muhammad said the woman is a wara or naked and her voice is a wara too. He also said the woman comes in the form of Satan and retreats in the shape of the devil. Muslim women are also not allowed to fall in love with Muslim men before marriage or choose their future husbands or life partners. This story is about the 3 innocent Muslim girls, Intisar, Firdaus, and Mona. Chapter 91. The girl escaping from the death penalty arrives at the Wad Khouli refugee camp. Wad Khouli camp is the largest refugee camp in Sudan. The camp is located exactly on the border between Sudan and Ethiopia. It's an emergency camp. It has no fence around it. It has no beginning or end. For those displaced refugees who lived in a refugee camp before, they cannot accept Wad Khouli as a refugee camp. It is worse than the Al-Hol camp in Iraq, which is full of Muslim female terrorists from Western countries. All these dangerous women terrorists want to go back to their European countries where they have citizenship. Most of the male terrorists who came from Western, African, Asian, and Arab countries were killed by the US-led coalition forces when they defeated and dismantled the Islamic Caliphate of ISIS. Those terrorists who surrendered were tried and sentenced to be hanged in Iraq and Syria. Some have been executed, others are on death row. Al Hol Camp is the largest refugee camp in the world. Wad Kol is just a place in the jungle in eastern Sudan where UN staff take in Eritrean refugees and provide them with food and little medical care. Refugees walk straight from Ethiopian territory to the camp. If you go up to the watchtower of the camp and see the refugees coming in their number of 10s, 20s, and 50s, you will think that they are like swarms of ants or locusts emerging from the ground. They are covered in dust, mud, dirt, and sweat. They are dressed in dirty, tattered rags, and their emaciated children are naked and barefoot. They are thirsty and hungry. Their skinny bodies are without flesh, and their emaciated babies walk like skeletons with big heads. They are victims of severe malnutrition. These displaced people have been walking for days. They abandoned their villages and towns and came to Sudan for food, shelter, death, and a decent burial. Those who escaped poverty and famine would be captured by the Ethiopian army or the Eritrean rebels. Only the elderly and children will be allowed to continue their dangerous walk into Sudan. Boys and girls who are eligible to take up arms and fight will be forced to join either the Ethiopian army or the Eritrean rebels. Their refusal to join either would mean a death sentence upon themselves. Some human smugglers studied the way and discovered escape routes for the youth. Their path is more dangerous than the Valley of the Shadow of Death, which the escaped girl, Intisar, passed through while roaming the streets of Khartoum and being held in a cell in Sudan. They have to fight off wild beasts and human thieves known as Shifta. At the darkness of the night, they hide under the cover of mountains and trees. Sometimes they bury themselves in the ground so that Ethiopian military helicopters do not spot and shoot them. Their food will be anything they find from the trees of the forest, animals, and edible insects. Their drinking water will be obtained from a river, muddy, dirty, known as Satit. It is a seasonal river and gets dry most of the time. If the displaced Eritreans are lucky enough to pass through all these dangers and escape death, they will reach Wad Koli Emergency Refugee Camp after at least 2 weeks of walking on their bare feet. Human smugglers expect to be paid for their risky services within a month after they bring the youths to the camp. If the Eritrean boys and girls fail to keep their promises to pay for their smuggling, the smugglers will make sure they are not left to live in peace in Sudan. Fearing for their lives, the smuggled girls will be forced to flee the refugee camp and become maidservants in Sudanese homes or go into prostitution to pay off their debts to the gang of people smugglers. Of course, they should have free sex with their smugglers all the way without asking for money for their sexual services. Even in Sudanese homes, Eritrean maids must agree to sex with males if they want to keep their jobs. Very often Eritrean girls are raped by Sudanese policemen and soldiers inside their refugee camps. Instead of guarding and protecting them inside the camp, these Sudanese security men abuse their power and rape Eritrean refugee girls and young women. According to the United Nations statistical report, more than 1,000 refugees cross the border every day to reach Wad Koli camp. The medical report showed that an Eritrean child dies every 5 minutes, and every 10 minutes an adult expires. The survivors would be kept in the camp for 3 months and then transferred to a permanent camp. There they would be officially registered as refugees, but not in Wad Koli. Accordingly, Camp Wad Koli can more properly be called a charitable place rather than a refugee camp. Each day when the refugees arrive at the camp, UN workers will cut down more trees and clear the forest to house them in small tents. They will provide them with water, food, and blankets. The blanket will be used as a mattress and cover. Then it is left to the newcomers to make sure that they do not get bitten by snakes or stung by poisonous scorpions or eaten alive by wild beasts. Many of the refugees have learned from their experience of 14 days in the jungle how to keep wild beasts away. From sunset to sunrise, they will cut down trees and burn their wood to drive away those ferocious beasts. The burning wood will create choking smoke. Sleepers will cough and sneeze all night. In addition to all these hardships, females will be subjected to sexual harassment by their Eritrean male counterparts, UN staff and workers, Sudanese policemen, and military soldiers. Especially the latter types of people who believe that their God-given rights or the law of their host country guarantee them privileges of sexual intercourse with Eritrean refugee women whether these girls agree to it or not. These are the dire conditions experienced by Eritrean refugees in Wad Koli camp, when the Christian bride fleeing a death sentence sought refuge and protection for her life inside. At 5:30 a.m., the girl, Intisar, who escaped from prison and death, followed the other two Eritrean girls until the three entered the camp. This is how they got in. First of all, there is a small river called Satit which separates the camp from the Sudanese village of Wad Kuli. The truck stopped at the village. From there they walked for a few kilometers until they reached the camp. There is only one temporary bridge connecting the Sudanese village to the refugee camp. This bridge is securely guarded by fully armed Sudanese soldiers. The two girls told Intisar that they could not enter the camp by crossing that bridge. The Sudanese soldiers will not allow anyone to enter or leave the bridge unless they obtain official documents from the Sudanese police authority in the camp. These are the police permission papers to leave the camp that put the runaway Christian bride, Intisar, in serious trouble with the Sudanese police when she falsely claimed at Khartoum International Airport that she was an Eritrean refugee girl. Fortunately, when the escaped prisoner from the gallows made her first visit to Wad Koli refugee camp, the muddy water of the river wasn't too deep. Despite this, the three girls crossed the water that reached their chests. Somehow they managed to cross the river without drowning their bodies in the murky water and not being swept away by the waves driven by the strong current. When Intisar entered the emergency camp and saw its residents, she could not believe that they were people or living creatures. She felt like she was on the day of judgment, and these refugees were resurrected from their graves to account on the last day for the sins they committed in their past earthly lives. A thought arose in her mind and became a strong conviction that she might not be able to survive a single day if she stayed in this infernal shadow of the Valley of Death camp. She had convinced herself that she would be safer in the woods with the wild beasts than she would be in the camp with these humanoid creatures grappling with death every second and minute. Even the hellish pit of her tomb-like cell and dungeon in the women's prison in Khartoum City were safer for her than the death camp at Wad Koli. So, the girl escaping from the death sentence immediately decided to leave the camp and go to the forest and live among the wild beasts. Her determination became stronger and her conviction heightened when her eyes saw the Sudanese soldiers walking around the camp with automatic rifles in their hands. Intisar also spotted several Sudanese policemen walking around with pistols strapped to their waists. She knew and understood that sooner or later the soldiers and policemen would know through the media on the radio or see her picture in the local newspapers about her escape from prison, and she would be rearrested, returned to Khartoum, and executed. That was why she immediately moved her feet and headed toward the boundary line. After only 1 hour's walk, the girl escaping from prison crossed the Sudanese border and entered Ethiopian territory. She is now outside the Sudanese border and walking on foreign land. Every now and then, she comes across the displaced who suffer from hunger. Intisar decided to continue walking aimlessly down the bumpy main road. She walks most of the time and rests for some time under the shade of trees. She wants to find a village or town where people still live. She walked all day. She walked more than she rested. At sunset, Intisar reached a small village. The village is completely deserted, except for some insects, birds, and mice. Now she is very tired and exhausted. Then she climbed upon a little hut called Rakoba, which is like an old ramshackle hut, and the damsel, fleeing death in her own country, spent her first night in a strange land. A 17-year-old girl spends the night alone in a deserted village. Anything could happen to her. But Intisar never thought for a moment what would happen to her if she slept alone in such a desolate place. She spent a night alone in the cemetery, alive among the bones of the dead in her home country, with the belief that a zombie would attack her and kill her and bury her with him in his grave. It was as if her sense of fear had died a long time ago. As if loss, pain, hunger, suffering, beatings, torture, abuse, rape, quarrels, convictions, imprisonment, refusal, the double death penalty of stoning and beheading, and insults killed her sense of fear and everything human inside her, turning her into a female animal with 2 legs. When Intisar woke up the next morning, her hunger pangs were very strong. She searched the whole village for something to eat but found nothing. Insects, birds, wild animals, and rats left nothing to eat. So, she left the village and continued her perilous and uncertain journey. After a short trip, she left the road and entered the forest in search of something to eat. Found some wild leaves that looked like dates in some trees. Then she took some stones and started throwing them in the trees. Her efforts resulted in some of those dry leaves being dropped. Because of the drought, these trees looked like artificial or burnt trees. She sucked out some of these dry fruits, stuffed her pockets with some, and continued her perilous and unsafe journey. After many hours of walking, Intisar came across a group of old men and women and their children walking along the road. She begged them for some food and a little water. They are generous enough to give her a few drops of water, but they have no food to offer her. She drank what they gave her and walked her way, and they walked their way. Intisar continued to walk quickly and run sometimes until the night she found her while she was walking. She is very worried when she can't find a village to sleep in. She is afraid to sleep in the open because she saw some snakes and scorpions crossing the road while walking. That's why Intisar decided to keep walking all night. After a long walk, she saw a fire burning on the road. Without a moment's hesitation, the runaway Sudanese bride walked straight to the fire. When she got to it, she found many old people with their little children all sleeping like lifeless bodies. They crouched in a deep sleep around the cave until she thought some of them were dead corpses. She crept quietly and laid her weary body near the fire and quickly went into a deep sleep herself too. She slept through the night like a tree trunk, without movements or dreams. The next morning, the scorching heat of the sun on her face caused her to wake up with a severe headache. She opened her eyes and looked around. She saw that the sleeping cave people had also woken up, except for 6 of them. Intisar soon realized that they had died in their sleep at night. She saw some old men and aged women laboriously opening their mouths to weep for their dead. Their eyes do not shed tears because of their dryness. Their bodies were drained of fluids. They are like walking corpses. None of them bothered with the appearance of the strange young girl in their midst. It might not disturb them even if they woke up and found Satan himself joining them in their slumber at night. Their main concern is to fight death and cling to life until they cross the border and reach the land of Sudan. Intisar wondered how they could bury their dead. None of them seemed strong enough to dig a hole an inch deep to bury a single fly. When the sun became hot enough, she saw 2 old men standing up and seizing the legs of a dead woman and beginning to drag her. The effort seemed to be too much for the 2 aged men. Intisar went ahead and offered them a hand. She grabbed the emaciated corpse's shoulders and carried it. The 2 old men and the compassionate foreign girl continued dragging the body until they reached the edge of the forest. The 2 old men let go of the dead old woman's legs and motioned for her to follow to fetch another old man's body. When this corpse was also taken away, Intisar saved them from the labor of carrying the bodies of 4 emaciated children. After this first step of the burial was successfully carried out, the runaway girl began to think about how these old men could dig 6 graves with her to bury the dead bodies. Her astonishment turned to shock when she saw the entire group wave their emaciated hands to her and resume their perilous journey towards Sudan. Although they didn't speak to her in their Tigrinya language, they all thought she was an Eritrean girl like them. Intisar wondered how a person could be forced by his desperate situation into such a helpless state of not being able to bury his son and daughter or his elderly father and his old, deceased mother. Could a man be compelled by dire necessity to leave the carcasses of his close relatives to the beasts and vultures to feed upon? She was baffled and pondered these questions for a long time. Meanwhile, her eyes are fixed on the group of miserable displaced Eritreans who are creeping up the bumpy road slowly like turtles. After standing for a long time near the unburied corpses and looking at the slow human reptiles, she offered prayer of mercy upon them. Then she surrendered herself towards her unknown destination and resumed her perilous walk. She continued walking for a few hours before stopping to walk exhaustingly and then entered the forest in search of food. She found her edible dry fruits, which are called in her country alalub. It is called Indian almond. The racist Arabs called them tamr alabid, which means the dates of slaves. They are also called in English balanites and grow on the soapberry tree. Intisar picked up some stones and threw them on a soapberry tree. The tree dropped the fruits of its dry leaves, the Indian almond. She sucked and ate them while sitting in the shade of the same tree. Luckily, she saw a small, dirty, muddy puddle of water near her. Necessity forced her to kneel like a stray animal and drink from that unhealthy water of the pond. When she quenched her thirst from that dirty water, a strange idea came to her mind. First, Intisar hesitated to apply for it. But the temptation is strong enough to make her give in. Yet she looked in all directions to assure herself that she was alone. She even looked up at the sky to see if a god or an angel was looking at her. When she became sure that there was no divine or angelic being or a demon hiding there but herself, the pretty foreign girl slipped out of her short pants and her little sleeveless shirt and took off her tall boots. She stopped again and looked around to assure herself that no one was watching what she was going to do next. Then the sexy girl took off her little black underwear and took off her red bra and stood completely naked in that one spot. She has become a female Tarzana without a loincloth or a lioness fur. She also became like a stripper in a nightclub for sexy teen dancers. By this time her black pubic hair had grown long and covered her private parts like a bush. During her long imprisonment in the women's prison inside the bottomless pit of the kingdom of Tartarus, the imprisoned Christian bride could not find an opportunity to shave her pubic hair or armpit hair. They kept her under lock and key like a wild beast or a dangerous criminal. Even wild beasts in Khartoum Zoo are treated better than female suspects and convicts in the women's prison. The girl escaping from prison, completely naked, began to feel the scorching African sun burning her soft skin as if it were at a temperature of 45 degrees Celsius. Or 176 degrees Fahrenheit. It's hotter than the sauna heat in the swimming pool. At first Intisar washed her clothes in water without soap and laid them on some rocks to dry. Then she began to gradually sink her naked body into the warm water of the stagnant pond. She enjoys the wonderful sensation of warm water lapping the tones of her sexy naked body. Then she swam in shallow backwater for more than an hour. Finally, the third innocent girl, Intisar, who miraculously escaped execution, felt that the waters of the forest had cleansed the filth and purified the two pollutants that defiled her pure body in the brothel and tavern of the pimp Lady Mother Nafisa, and the house of slavery for the cruel wife of the military major, Al-Sanusi, the Islamic legal rape slaughterhouse where she killed her rapist, Hassan, and the horrific tortures of female guards, and healed the scars of beatings by the Muslim female terrorists inside Kober Central Prison for Women, and her suffering in her dark tomb-like cell into which she was thrown. She now has the same wonderful feeling that a devout Hindu woman might have after having cleansed and purified her naked body in the sacred river Ganga Jamna. Then Tarzana of the jungle of Africa came out of the holy water of her pond and sat down on a sacred rock to dry her purified body. While sitting, she also hears the sounds and singing of birds chirping in the trees. They are great moments. She closed her beautiful eyes and opened the screen of her imagination. She could now see him from afar as he ran toward her. Minutes later, he reached her and embraced her purified and sanctified naked body. Then he kissed her sweet lips. She completely surrendered to him and felt his hands touch her all over her sexy naked body. Her holy Christian groom first caressed her breasts, then fondled her private parts and began making love to her. The unjustly separated lovers continued to enjoy each other's naked bodies for a long time as if they were in a hotel room on their honeymoon. In the meantime, the charming, naked bride, Intisar, kept embracing her body, kissing her lips, sucking the nipples of her breasts, and licking the rest of her private parts. Her imagination was fueled by one of those wonderful nights she spent with her lover at the hotel during their wonderful honeymoon. She did not open her eyes and look around until she completely satiated her body sexually through self-masturbation by inserting her middle two fingers into her hairy pussy and rubbing them in and out quickly and at a steady pace, which made her reach an earth-shattering orgasm. The horribly abused teenage girl's mind and heart are finally freed, and she has achieved her true freedom from the infernal prison of Sudanese women in which she was buried for so long in the city of Khartoum. These wonderful realization and sex satisfaction made the beautiful and sexy naked Christian holy bride Intisar ponder and yearn to meet her handsome lover and Christian holy groom Sammy. Chapter 92. Life outside the borders of the Democratic Republic of Satan. As soon as Intisar reached the road, she saw them again. They crawl along the road in their rags and emaciated bodies like a flock of ducking turtles. This time they are marching in great numbers as if the inhabitants of an entire village or town had been driven out of their huts by famine and are now migrating together to Sudan. She waved her hand to them, but no one waved to her. Nor is anyone dangerous to her. She knows that they are harmless creatures. Their miserable situation has turned them into a new kind of creature. They have become neither people nor animals. They are humanoid in their outward appearance, but in reality they have become like half humans and half animals. They walked their way and she walked her way. This time, after they disappeared from her vision, the girl fleeing from the noose of the gallows realized that they were walking towards her country in search of safety and protection from war and famine, while she was walking in their country in search of rescue and a safe haven from death. What a contradiction, she asked herself, puzzled and amazed. How can a country where its people sought to kill and destroy the life of an innocent girl like her provide sanctuary and protection to these harmless human creatures? This contrast led her to think about why they and she became like that. They are victims of a civil war, of racial and existential war, of ethnic cleansing, and she is the victim of an emotional, social, class, and religious war. Why should Ethiopians and Eritreans quarrel over a piece of land and ethnic difference? And why should the rich hate the poor while Christians and Muslims disagree over religious books and a God they believe created them all? She walked for many hours. While walking, Intisar tries to find an answer to her question, but she finds nothing but a small village. It seems that the village is still inhabited because from afar, smoke was seen. She quickened her steps and entered the village. When she reached the fire, she found anthropomorphic and animal creatures. Their old, decrepit females had nothing left on their bodies to classify them as women. Each one became like a hermaphrodite. Every old woman among them looks like Gokul, that ugly old hag woman who was an evil witch in the novel King Solomon's Mines by Alan Quatermain. Their old, hunchbacked males look like demi-humans who each resemble the fearsome hobbit Gollum who appeared in the movie The Lord of the Rings. Their male and female children look like the frightful creature above except that they are 10 times smaller in shape and 50 times more terrifying than the hunchbacked Gollum. This time they are in very large numbers. Most of them are children. They're emaciated, skeletal youngsters are not like the other children in the world. They don't play, they don't talk, they don't walk, they don't smile, and they don't laugh. They are like girls' dolls and boys' toys. Unless someone picks them up or moves them, they stick together like stones. Why are they different from other children in the world? Because they are starving and dying of malnutrition. They were born yesterday and today they die. They were born not to live, but to die. Who are the killers of such innocent children? The Ethiopians say that the Eritreans are the reason for their premature death, and the Eritreans blame their sudden death on the Ethiopians. Intisar joined them as if she had come to a place of mourning for the victims of civil and ethnic war or the tomb of the unknown soldier who died of war in the woods. She looks at them with a merciful heart. And as soon as it got dark at sunset, they fell into a deep sleep. A city girl like Intisar is not used to going to bed early. Therefore, she just kept sitting and looking at them. She wonders which of them will sleep forever. She asked herself what would she do if the angel of death killed them all at night. None of them could dig a single grave if they escaped mass destruction. They won't get the dead from them even a mass grave. She doubted whether her physical strength could enable her to drag them all into the woods and leave them unburied. What a pity they will not receive a proper burial like those 6 distinguished ones whom she met before and co-buried in the manner of the forest displaced. Intisar found an old, dilapidated hut, climbed into it, and decided to spend her 3rd night in the woods on top of it, like a monkey sleeping in a tree. She took off her boots and used them instead of a pillow. It reminded her of the first night she had fallen asleep under a large car in Khartoum City. Then people thought that she was either a teenage girl who committed adultery before marriage, became pregnant with unlawful sexual intercourse, and was slain in an honor killing by her father, or a homeless street prostitute. As she slept on the second night over the grave of her late sister Firdos in the cemetery of the Al-Ad Sharfi, the mob mistook her for a raging zombie and tried to stone her. On her third night, when she slept inside an old boat, the old boat owner thought she was the fairy, Alginia, the beautiful bride of the Nile River. He fainted from fear, and his 4 sons fled in great terror and plunged into the river water. But here, far from her cursed fatherland, on her third night in the jungle of Ethiopia, she did not go to sleep under a car, or on top of a grave, or in a boat in the river at night in the open. Immediately, Intisar fell into a deep sleep. She fell asleep again like a log without moving or dreaming. When she woke up the next day, she felt refreshed. She put on her tall boots and tied them tightly. She is now ready for the 4th day of adventure and perilous hiking in the rugged jungles of Africa. Before she left the village, she went to check on the people she had seen sleeping at night. She wants to know who of them has died and who of them is still alive and kicking. Intisar found that some of them were gone and some were left to continue their rest. She thought those Eritrean refugees were still asleep. She approached them and examined the first woman. She found her dead and her sleep was gone at night. She examined an old man. She had also found him to have expired. She checked the third one and he died too. Intisar stopped examining them and looked at their children. All of them died during the night. She counted their numbers. They are 10 men, 15 women, and 20 children. Intisar sensed that the presence of death was very strong in that place. She believed that if she continued to stand in this place of death, she might herself breathe her last and depart from this life. This thought frightened her and made her flee for her life. She ran away as if the angel of death was pursuing her or the devil was chasing her with a pitchfork in his hands. Intisar ran nonstop until she assured herself that she had arrived far from the fearful presence of death. The girl escaping from execution felt that she had become close at the hands of the angel of death on her 4th day in the forest of Ethiopia. Even when she was under the gallows in Freedom Square in Khartoum, while the evil policewoman Sakina's huge hands were holding and dragging her to the executioner, and when she chose between the stones of the mob and the bullets of the 2 soldiers at the gate of the military base in Sudan. Then she stopped running from death and sat down under a tree to rest. While resting, she began to wonder how long she would walk and how far she would have to go before she could find a final resting place. The GPS in her mind has no final destination. She felt as if she had flown on the wings of a falcon from a cursed planet called Sudan and landed on another terrifying planet known as Ethiopia, a land of war, famine, and famine. Will she walk and walk in this empty outer space with no food, water, or homes until she turns into one of those skeletal old women walking like dead bodies? She did not find an answer to her question. She got up and continued her difficult, unsafe, and aimless journey. She walked all day until evening. She found no village or shelter from the darkness of the night. She went to a tree and ate its dry fruits as usual, but she did not find water to drink. Her lips parched from extreme thirst. Intisar became very tired and exhausted. She is now dragging her numb legs. In that miserable state, she managed to walk for an hour or so. She lost all her physical strength and became paralyzed. When her body ran out of gas, she fell onto the road, buried by the night in complete darkness. She can't see anything around. Intisar became very afraid. She thought she might get stung by a snake or a scorpion. An inch forward, she was paralyzed and her body could no longer move. As she lay lifeless, she fought 2 or 3 times against sleep, but at last sleep took hold of her mind and body, and she fell into a deep slumber like a corpse. Intisar spent her 4th night in the forest, unconscious and unaware of the world around her. She is as if a person has lost consciousness or an animal in hibernation in the extreme cold of the Canadian Arctic tundra. She was neither dead nor alive. She was in an indescribable ontological comatose. In the early morning of the 5th day, the escaped prisoner returned to life from her existential state, like the emergence of a drunk woman from her stupor caused by excessive drinking of alcohol, or the resurrection of a sluggish zombie girl buried tall from her grave. The stillness of the woods, the singing and chirping of birds, and the feeling of escaping a night's sleep on the way in such a frightening place made her begin her 5th day with a prayer of thanksgiving to God. When her prayer ended, she began to worry about finding water to drink. She is dying of thirst. She got to her feet and tried to walk. Intisar felt nauseous, dizzy, and about to fall. Her tired and exhausted body could not hold her anymore. She sat on the dirt ground again. Then she crawled to her knees and got out of the way and sat under the shade of a tree. After a long period of rest, she felt she could walk again. This time her walk resembles that of other emaciated Eritrean refugees she has seen crawling like a pack of tortoises through the forest. At this slow pace, the prisoner fleeing from death dragged her body for a while. Every now and then you stop and rest. Many times, she searched in the woods for water, but her search did not help her find the thing she wanted. She began to worry that she might collapse on the road and slowly die in this lonely place. Despite her crippled and drugged body, she decides to walk until she finally dies. She now walks like a very drunk woman who can neither walk straight nor straighten her tattered body completely. Back she walks with a limp, her body bent just like a paralyzed young woman. As she was limping and dragging her numb legs along the secluded path in the spooky place, Intisar suddenly heard the sound of a helicopter flying over the forest trees. The sound of the helicopter warns her that she is not far from an army camp. She fears that the helicopter soldiers will mistake her for an Eritrean rebel girl, shoot her, and throw her to the ground with a dead body riddled with hundreds of bullets. The fear of being shot and killed forced her to pull her stiff legs off the road and enter into the woods to hide from the helicopter gunship. As soon as Intisar got under the tall trees in the woods, she started to hear heavy gunfire very close by. The raging gunfire reminded her of the battle raging in the Valley of the Shadow of Death in Khartoum's Freedom Square, which took place because of the change in the manner of her execution. The sound was followed by the steps of fleeing people and the screams of many revolutionaries. She became very afraid. She guessed she was caught again in the middle of a heated battle. Through the trees, she saw soldiers in uniform running in her direction. They carry their machine guns. She knows that if she does nothing, these soldiers will arrive at her place within minutes and kill her. Immediately, she climbed onto a tree and hid among its branches. From her hiding place above, she saw many soldiers running under her tree. None of them saw her. They all ran inside the jungle to hide from the helicopter. Shortly after they passed under the tree, she saw the helicopter flying overhead. She guessed the fleeing soldiers were Eritrean rebel fighters who were chased down by an Ethiopian military helicopter. The helicopter was still shooting at the trees when it reached her. The girl, who is hiding in fear, is scared to be hit in the head by a stray bullet and falls dead. Fortunately, the helicopter flew over her head without shooting her. The sound of the helicopter gradually died down. Like a frightened bird, Intisar remained hidden in her watchtower for a long time. The fear of being killed took half of her fatigue away and gave some strength to her dying body. The stillness of the forest has been restored and the birds are singing again. Despite this, Intisar clung to her branches like a frightened monkey. When she was sure that the sound of war and warriors might not be repeated again, she climbed down and landed on the ground. Then Intisar got out of the dense forest of trees and went to the road very carefully. The first scene that catches her attention is the fall of a soldier. At first, she hesitated to go to him for fear that he would still be alive and shoot her and kill her. Despite her dismay, she slowly and fearfully approached him. His face revealed to her that he was killed by the helicopter's bullets. His wounds are still open and bleeding profusely. On his back, she saw a vessel with fresh drinking water attached. She bent over him and untied the pot slowly and carefully. Immediately, she hastily filled her thirsty mouth with sweet water. After that, Intisar searched his pockets and found some dry dates, and biscuits. She removed all those treasures and ate some of them in haste, filling her pockets with the rest. Then she slung the bowl of water over her shoulder. She saw a small watch on the wrist of the soldier who treasured it, and she snatched it. It reminded her of her lover's precious gift, which her wretched condition had forced her to sell in her native land. Before she left, she decided to bury her martyr treasure soldier in a decent manner, according to the custom of the displaced Eritreans, in the bushes. Intisar was saddened that such a handsome Eritrean youth must die a martyr to save her life. After she drank some water and ate food, she felt refreshed and her soul finally rested in her dying body. Then she dragged out the body of the dead soldier she treasured and placed his corpse under a tree. Intisar thought he was a martyr of love, and perhaps he had a beautiful girlfriend somewhere in this foreign country. After that, she offered a short prayer for his soul and left. For someone like the runaway Sudanese girl Intisar, pockets full of dried meat, dates, biscuits, and a small bowl full of healthy water are treasures more valuable than all of King Solomon's treasure troves. But if she knew how far away she was from the Ethiopian military base, she wouldn't consider the heavenly manna to be of much use to her anymore. Every step she takes after that brings her closer and closer to the military base. The people in that base weren't like the harmless humanoid creatures she met every now and then in the woods. They are trained soldiers. They are forces trained to kill. They are army soldiers armed to the teeth. Many of them are thieves, rapists, and murderers. They hate the Eritrean rebels more than they hate Satan and his minions. They wouldn't hesitate for a second if they set their eyes on her in such a scary forest to ruthlessly beat, gang rape, and kill her. Who will prosecute them for the crimes they commit every day against the innocent women and girls of Eritrea? They believe that no one can hold them accountable, not even the Almighty God who created them. They are like the Muslim mujahideen who believe that God has given them absolute right over the bodies of the impure women they call their infidel enemies to rape them without having to marry them. Then they have to enslave them with their children and sell them as slaves in the slave market. They do those atrocities the helpless captive women after slaughtering their infidel husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons. The runaway Christian bride, Intisar, has arrived hundreds of miles away from her motherland, not knowing that it was God who snatched her neck from the gallows and released her body from the hands of the lioness policewoman, Sakina Shit Allah, Abd al-Shaitan. He also extinguished the bullet fired at her from close range by the Khartoum International Airport Security Police Inspector, Alamin Abd Iblis Abd al-Masi al-Dajjal. On the contrary, she saw that God had treated her cruelly and unfairly. She felt that he was repaying her for the evil she had done against her late, innocent sister Firdaus. With her heavenly treasure in her pockets and on her shoulder, the runaway girl walked for a few hours and then began to hear the sound of the helicopter again. She would walk straight to the danger zone at the Ethiopian military base if she kept walking for another half hour. Whether one was to call it mere coincidence or divine intervention, it didn't matter as long as her life was saved by the death eagle flying over her head. If she had continued for another 15 minutes, the Ethiopian sniper soldiers from the watchtower would have shot and killed her a mile away. The sound of the chopper again forced her to run and hide inside the woods. She remembered how her treasure soldier had brutally murdered and how his body was riddled with bullets. As before, the sound of the helicopter was mixed with gunfire and the screams of the warriors. Intisar found another tree and climbed over it and hid like a bird fleeing from a hawk. From her hideout, Eritrean rebels could be seen running beneath her, fleeing for their lives. Another sound of a second helicopter approaching her as the chopper passed over her tree of life. She could even see those two helicopters raining bullets down the trees. Intisar witnessed how many Eritrean rebels were shot and killed. She saw some of them running under her, their bodies spurting blood. They are very many. The secluded forest suddenly became noisy and busy as if it was a market in a crowded city. It is not a place for buyers and sellers, but a war zone for soldiers and rebels. The place was filled with flames, smoke, and screams. She could hear the sounds of military vehicles driving along the road. In that forest, she never expected to see a person riding a bicycle or a donkey, but now she heard many military trucks. The emaciated, harmless humanoid creatures seemed to have eaten all their donkeys, horses, and cattle before turning into walking skeletons and dying. Intisar began to hear loud voices of people chanting victory or defeat, but she did not know who the victors were and who were the losers. And the foreign, Christian hiding girl prayed to God for her murdered body and the departed soul after seconds, and not for her safety. She felt closer to death than the time Sakina, a fat elephant, dragged her to the gallows by force, who was a man disguised as a tough policewoman. She also closed her eyes because she expected that she would be closer to her final departure from the land of the living and descending into the world of the dead than when she was in the Freedom Square in Khartoum, which was like a Roman amphitheater full of titans gladiators from the security, beastly forces, and human monsters of Muslims. Battle of lions and tigers against gladiators armed with white weapons. She expected that at any moment the torrential stream of bullets might hit her body and send her dead to the ground. The deadly battle lasted for 2 hours above and below, but not a single bullet fell on her body from the torrential rain caused by the heavy gunfire. She felt as if someone had placed an invisible iron canopy over her head and shielded her from the torrential rain of lead. She concludes that the same mighty angels who protected her on the battlefield in Sudan have once again descended from heaven and are saving her life now in the jungle of Ethiopia. So, she offered a prayer of thanksgiving to her Creator again. Although the battle was over after sunset, the frightened girl spent her 5th night in the land of Abyssinia, clinging to her tree of life. In the early morning of the 6th day, Intisar heard many military trucks coming towards her hiding place. She guessed that the Ethiopian soldiers most likely came to survey the battlefield. Therefore, she quickly descended from her tree of life and fled into the forest and ran as fast as her feet could take her. She flies like a frightened little sparrow, fleeing at the speed of light from the deadly falcon hawk chasing her at the speed of sound. Chapter 93. The arrest of the suspected terrorist Muslim girl. The Christian bride, Intisar, who fled from her motherland of Sudan as a result of the issuance of the obedience sentence against her and the death penalty for her apostasy from Islam, embracing Christianity and supposed adultery with her Christian groom, Sami, continued her escape in the jungles of Ethiopia for many hours. When she learned she was far and safe from Ethiopian soldiers and Eritrean rebels, she sat under a tree to rest. Then she opened the heavenly treasure of hers which she had taken from the unknown soldier and ate and drank it. She looked at her new stolen watch. Ethiopian local time is 2:15 p.m. Intisar understood that she ran for about 7 hours. After eating her first meal of the day and knowing how much time she has spent running, she decides to take a short nap, then wake up and continue on foot on an unknown and perilous journey in a foreign land. As soon as she laid her exhausted body to rest and closed her eyes, she fell into a deep sleep and seemed to snore loudly. She is like a little girl who slept on the floor of her house after eating her food, waiting for her loving mother to come and carry her in her arms and take her to her bed. She is weary from the terrifying night she spent atop the tree of knowledge of good and evil for the innocent Eritrean rebels and evil Ethiopian soldiers. She slept for many hours. Most likely, she may continue to sleep until midday the next day. Her deep sleep was interrupted by a heavy boot kicking her back. Intisar woke up with sleepy goosebumps. When she looked up, she found herself surrounded by many angry and frightened faces of Abyssinian soldiers. At first she thinks she has been visited by some demonic creatures or is having one of her terrifying nightmares in her tomb-like cell in Khartoum. Their faces are covered in mud and blood. Their teeth are yellow and their eyes are red. They looked like cannibals among the African jungle savages who gathered around her to devour her fresh, raw meat. When she saw that their guns were aimed at her head, the foreign girl escaping from prison, Intisar, realized that she was not free and safe in the forest anymore. Unfortunately, on the 7th day of her temporary freedom, the escaped Christian bride was finally caught. The fugitive Sudanese prisoner has been held for nearly 2 months in prison in her home country. Then she escaped from the gallows by a rare miracle and walked all the way nearly 1,000 miles from her native country until she reached a foreign country walking day and night and hiding in the woods among the bushes and trees. In the end, she fell into the hands of Ethiopian soldiers who are even more ruthless than the heartless female police interrogators and Muslim terrorists in the women's prison in Khartoum. Intisar's perilous march to freedom is more painful and full of hardships than that of Witold Jelinsky, who walked 4,000 miles to freedom all the way from a maximum security prison camp in Siberia, Russia, to India. Witold Jelinsky fled across the Gobi Desert and across the Himalayas to freedom in Hindustan. He trekked through frozen forests and through mountains and deserts in a journey that took 11 months. Likewise, the Christian bride fleeing from prison, Intisar Ibrahim Mustafa Jabir, miraculously escaped from the gallows in Sudan and walked thousands of miles in the valley of the shadow of death, the dangerous African jungle. Ultimately, she falls victim at the hands of Ethiopian soldiers who are more dangerous than her Sudanese rapists, hardened policewomen detectives, and Muslim terrorists, the Nasiba sisters. What a pity the Sudanese fugitive was captured by the Ethiopian army. The Ethiopians considered her to be a rebellious Eritrean girl. Then they brought her to their military base camp in Eritrea and kept her as a prisoner of war. They planned to extract some information from her and get rid of her. This is how they deal with Eritrean prisoners. They will not be allowed to live more than a day or two from the time they are captured. Ethiopian soldiers do not follow nor believe in the Geneva Convention on the Rules of War and the treatment of prisoners of war. On the contrary, they believe that the Eritrean rebels are not combatant soldiers, but dangerous Muslim terrorists like the Mujahideen of ISIS, Boko Haram, Janjaweed, Hamas, Hezbollah, Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, and Taliban fighters. The Geneva Convention states that a combatant is a person who takes a direct part in the hostilities of an armed conflict. If a combatant follows the law of war, he is considered a privileged combatant and, upon capture, becomes a prisoner of war. Under the Third Geneva Convention, a non-distinguished combatant is a person such as a mercenary who takes a direct part in hostilities, but upon capture is not eligible for prisoner of war status. Ethiopian soldiers took advantage of the current debate is whether the rules of the Geneva Convention of War apply to Islamic terrorists, especially since terrorism does not have a universally agreed upon definition. The Geneva Conventions, 1949, and Additional Protocols, 1977, form the basis of international humanitarian law in times of war. The treaty focuses on the treatment of hostile forces as well as civilians living in occupied territory. The captive Sudanese girl Intisar was brought to the military base and thrown into a small dark room, which is no less terrifying than the endless hole in the terrifying Sudanese prison in which she was held before being transferred to Kober Central Prison for Women. In her new detention, the Sudanese captive found that there were some Eritrean boys and girls in captivity. The captive boys are more than the captive girls. Her fear increased when she made the unpleasant discovery that, for the first time in her tragic life, she as a female had become imprisoned with males. Fortunately, they were all tied with ropes to long, thick wooden poles. If they were not restrained, the male captives would surely gang rape at night every female captive who is locked with them in the same room without light. Each female detainee will be gang raped by at least 5 to 7 boys. Intisar saw all of their faces disfigured as a result of severe beatings and their bodies stained with blood, mud, and slime. Some of them are half naked and some are half dead. Some of them were seriously injured and passed out, and some of them died anyway. In her new dangerous military detention, the foreign captive, Intisar, spent her 7th night in the soil of Ethiopia, sleeping alongside male and female Eritrean rebel detainees. Some of these captives kept talking to each other in a strange language, to which it was all Greek for her. Early the next morning she was taken in for questioning. Soldiers interrogating her beat and tortured her when she could not speak to them in Eritrean Tigrinya or their Ethiopian language, Amharic. While they beat her with sticks and whips, she kept crying and begging for mercy in her mother tongue. None of them speak Arabic. The detective soldiers finally come to the unavoidable truth that the captive girl they are torturing is a foreigner from another country. However, they cannot know her country of origin and the foreign language she speaks. One of them is smart enough to know how to solve the problem of communication with their alien captive. Although he can read and write English, he still cannot speak it. So, the shrewd soldier brought a pen and paper and wrote in plain English, "What language do you speak, and from which foreign country did you come to our country, Ethiopia?" With a trembling hand, the foreign captive wrote, "I am a Sudanese girl, and I recently came to Ethiopian lands, and my mother tongue is Arabic." The second question, which naturally followed, "How did you come to Ethiopia, and how did you happen to be hiding in the jungle among those damned Eritrean Muslim terrorists?" Intisar desperately tried to distance herself from the Eritrean rebels and their cause, which she did not know and might not care if she did, but her explanation was rejected by her executioners. Then the Ethiopian soldiers tried to nail her with a crime so serious that it is considered even more serious than the crime of the Eritrean rebel for which she was captured. They have decided to view her as a dangerous mercenary or a hired professional soldier who fights for any country or nation without regard to political interests or issues. Some of them went so far as to accuse her of being a Muslim Arab terrorist or a foreign jihadist fighter who joined the rebel Eritreans because they are Muslims to fight their infidel enemies, the Ethiopian Christians. The foreign captive Intisar cried and begged them for mercy on her bent knees and wrote to them that, "I am a peaceful Christian girl and not a Muslim terrorist." Then the interrogating Ethiopian soldiers brought 4 of their female soldiers and ordered them to verify or refute her claim by examining her genitals to see if she had been subjected to female genital mutilation as a child, as is done to every Eritrean Muslim girl, or was she uncircumcised like the Ethiopian Christian girl. Accordingly, she was stripped of her outer clothing, the shirt and pants, and her small black swimsuit-like underwear, and the Ethiopian Christian soldiers examined her private parts, and unfortunately, the result was positive. The ugly scars on her hairy pussy spoke loud and clear that she was a circumcised Muslim girl with mutilated genitals from an early age. Then she tried to convince them that she was indeed born and raised as a Sudanese Muslim girl, but had recently converted to Christianity while living with a Coptic Christian family in the city of Khartoum. Her torturers rejected her allegations, but decided to refer her case to their headquarters at the General Command of the Ethiopian Army in Addis Ababa city. They understood that the condition of the foreign captive girl Intisar is somewhat different from that of other Eritrean female prisoners of war. After that harsh interrogation of the foreign captive over the hands of the Ethiopian soldiers, both male and female, through severe beatings and erosion, by examining and exposing her circumcised private parts, her body, which had been severely beaten with whips and sticks, was returned and thrown again into the new dark abyss. Also, after their harsh interrogation and extraction of important confidential information from their bleeding mouths, many of the Eritrean captive boys and girls who were being held with Intisar were killed by live bullets fired at close range in their heads in front of her eyes. Their corpses were then pulled out of the death camp room like slaughtered animals. Fortunately, she is the only captive whose life was spared, as the ruthless Ethiopian soldiers still question her true identity. They cannot prove or disprove that she is an Eritrean Muslim terrorist or a traitorous Ethiopian spy girl. Shortly thereafter, the foreign captive, Intisar, was transferred to another Ethiopian military prison and was treated better than when she was in the dark trench where she was held with the rebel Eritrean freedom martyrs. She now receives 3 regular meals a day and is allowed to shower and use the public restroom for Ethiopian female soldiers. Her captors gave her some clothes to wear and took her dirty clothes and sent them to a caterer to be washed and ironed. 2 weeks later, a group of some high-ranking Ethiopian soldiers' senior officers came from Addis Ababa with an Arabic interpreter. The Arabic translator happens to be a Sudanese refugee living in a refugee camp in the capital of Ethiopia. Fortunately, he hates Sudan more than he hates Satan. Before he himself became a rebel in the Darfur region of western Sudan, the Rapid Support Forces, who were known at the time as the Muslim Janjaweed militias, killed his parents, massacred his 3 brothers, and raped his 2 minor sisters. When the imprisoned Sudanese girl Intisar recounted her tragedy while crying, how she was tortured, raped, falsely accused, and sentenced to death, the compassionate Arabic interpreter shed hot tears as well. The story of her torture, persecution, and rape is more brutal than what happened to his 2 sisters. He concluded that she had suffered, tortured, persecuted, imprisoned, tried, mistreated, and raped much more brutally than the Janjaweed soldiers had done to his two underage sisters. Accordingly, the Sudanese refugee translator sided with the Sudanese captive and convinced the senior Ethiopian army officers that she was truthful in what she said had happened to her in her motherland, and that it was exactly what she claimed she was. Moreover, he told them she had no dog in the fight between Ethiopian soldiers and Eritrean rebels. Although the senior Ethiopian army officers understood and were convinced that the Sudanese captive girl they held had no personal interest in their fight with the Eritreans, they did not release her. Now the prisoner, Intisar, is being held on charge of smuggling herself illegally across the Sudanese border into Ethiopian territory. After that, her felony case was referred to the Ethiopian Central Intelligence Department in Asmara, the capital of Eritrea. Before being transferred by helicopter from the military base in the Eritrean province to the Asmara women's prison, Intisar was treated kindly by the Ethiopian soldiers. She was treated for her many wounds by a military medical team. Besides being allowed to eat 3 good meals a day, take a shower, and use the women's restroom, she was also given a kind of freedom. She can now leave her locked room at will and wander around the courtyard of the military base. She has been strictly warned not to attempt to escape or exit the base. She was told that she might be shot dead by soldier snipers if she tried to escape. In a short time, Intisar became good friends with the kind Sudanese translator. He informed her that his name was Mr. Yasser Ahmed Abdulaziz, and she told him that her name was Mrs. Intisar Ibrahim Mustafa Jabir. He also said that he is married to an Ethiopian Christian woman known as Ababa Tesfaye, and they have 6 children, 4 daughters and 2 sons. She also informed him that she is a new Christian bride and that her Sudanese groom is called Sami Osman al-Taib, but they do not have children yet. She told him with tears that she had aborted her first fetus, which she bore from her Christian husband, Sami, as a result of the severe beating and brutal rape that her alleged Muslim husband, Hassan, had exposed them to, whom she slaughtered in defense of her honor on the 3rd night of her bloody fight with him, which lasted 3 days and 3 nights, in the Obedience House room when she was still in remand in the notorious Kober Central Prison for Women. Mr. Abdulaziz told Mrs. Intisar that he, his Ethiopian wife, and their 6 children will soon be sent by the UN office for resettlement in a Western country, but the office representative did not specify which country. This last piece of information reminded the Christian wife, Intisar, of her failed foreign trip with her Christian husband, Sami, to resettle them as Eritrean refugees in Canada. However, she decided not to share such a secret problem about her tragic life in Sudan with her new acquaintance in Ethiopia. Although he was a Muslim and knew that she had left Islam and became an apostate and infidel Christian girl, the Sudanese translator did not hate her and did not try to stir up an unnecessary, malicious, religious problem for her with the Ethiopian soldiers who were from Christian backgrounds. Finally, Mr. Abdelaziz confessed to Mrs. Intisar that he found some Christians in Addis Ababa to be 100 times better than the Janjaweed Muslims of Darfur who killed his parents and 3 brothers and brutally raped his 2 underage sisters. As a good example, he pointed to his beloved Christian wife Ababa Tesfaye and her loving Ethiopian parents and siblings who were all Orthodox Christians. He also mentioned that most of the UN staff in Addis Ababa are Western Christians from Europe and treat him with love even though they know he is a Muslim man.